one of the things I want to return to now, you were talking about the cascading of racial disparity as you progress through the criminal justice system, after someone gets arrested. So we can look at what you said, the disproportionate rates for the stopping and the arresting, right? Like the initial phase. But then there's actually the sentencing and conviction phase. Can you elaborate a little bit more on where we see racial disparities within sentencing and conviction?
Sure. So what happens is, the way that I like to think about it is, the criminal justice system can't do that much about the differences in crime rates I talked about earlier, though in some ways it can make it worse by processing people through the system, especially for very trivial things like marijuana possession. And what happens when someone has marijuana conviction on their record is for the rest of their lives, that's going to be something that comes up when they apply for a job, when they apply for housing. So when you have police forces disproportionately looking for that in communities of color, low-income communities of color, that means you're disproportionately harming the life outcomes of people in those communities who got picked up for that very low-level thing. But so anyways, setting aside the disparities in crime rates, within the criminal justice system, at every stage what we see is a little bit of racial disparity. First question is, if you've committed what's considered a crime that the criminal justice system deals with, do you even get arrested? Do you get picked up? After the arrest, does the prosecutor decide to dismiss charges against you or not? Race matters there. And, it's not a huge difference between blacks or whites and other people of color, but there's some difference. Then the question is, so does the prosecutor dismiss charges? And if the prosecutor brings charges against you, do they bring charges that carry a mandatory minimum sentence? Race matters there, because that charging decision is going to tie the judge's hands, and it's going to threaten you with a very long sentence. The next question is, are you held pre-trial while you're figuring out your case? Race matters there, and the way that matters is not just by the discretion of people that are deciding whether or not you should be detained pre-trial, but whether or not you can afford to post bail. And we know that people of color and African Americans in particular are disproportionately likely to be poor in our country. And so they're less likely to be able to post bail if it's demanded. After the bail question, when extent that the judge has discretion, that becomes relevant, because the judge is going to look at you and think, well, is this an upstanding person that messed up once, or is this someone who likely has had a lot of encounters with crime and is going to continue to go on to criminally offend afterwards? Race matters in that decision. And if they've held in pretrial detention, and if there's a mandatory sentence that's been imposed, threatened on against them, they're going to accept a worse plea offer than if they were otherwise in a different situation. And so people of color disproportionately end up accepting worse plea offers and given worse plea offers than whites. Once you're in prison, what kind of interaction do you have with the guards? How often are you going to get written up for not listening to the guards and obeying their orders? We know that race matters there as well, and that disciplinary record in prison is going to be something that determines whether you qualify for earlier release because of good behavior. It's going to potentially delay your parole. So then after you're released, if you have a criminal record, you're going to have a very difficult time applying for housing, employment, especially with the discretionary decisions there, whether what an employer thinks of you, what a landlord thinks of you. Race becomes very relevant again there. People who have criminal records are discriminated against in all kinds of markets that they face afterwards. But if they're black and they have a criminal record, they're especially likely to be discriminated against. So, the punishment is not over when you're done with your sentence of prison, probation, or whatever. It's going to continue to haunt you, that record, for the rest of your life. It's going to make it so that your family is poorer than you would have otherwise been.
I want to go back a second to policing, because that seems to be the focus of the protests currently. There's a lot of people, again, talking about the police being racist. And from what I've understood from everything you've said, there appears to be a lot of bias throughout the whole criminal justice system. So I guess my question is, do you think police and police departments are more racist than the other steps in the criminal justice system?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if policing is more racist or not. I know that something that people think about is the issue of educational level and training with policing, and compared to, for example, the attorneys that are going to be processing your case after you're arrested. Police tend to have lower levels of education, and so there are calls to require police officers to at least have a college degree, and so that's one issue. But certainly there are people that a college degree doesn't erase bias, and it doesn't make people more aware of the systemic racism or more able necessarily to tackle the problem in their workplace. So there have been a number of studies that have been done to reveal the presence of implicit bias among regular people and people working in different fields, including among police officers. And so what some of these studies do is, for example, show pictures to people, to officers, and ask them, okay, well, here's a simulated experiment. When you see a picture of someone holding a weapon, we want you to press a button here. And if you see someone who's holding something that's not a weapon, press this other button. And what happens is that when you do that kind of experiment with people that are not police officers, researchers have found quite a lot of bias where people will incorrectly identify something as a weapon that's not a weapon. It's held by a person of color, in particular, as someone who's African American. And so there's that misidentification of what an object is in someone's hand because of the assumption of the association of criminality with African Americans. And when these kinds of studies have been done with police officers, what they found is that police officers actually tend to be less biased than the general public, but there is still bias in how they perform these experiments. So they're more likely to more rapidly identify the weapon in the hand of the person who's African American than when they see it in the hand of a person who's white. So that's just one example. The evidence of bias in experiments that have been done, but also in when you look more systematically at the actual outcome of policing work that's done.
That's very interesting. So if you were to generalize, and I don't know if it's even useful to give any sort of figure, but if we're talking about a majority of Americans, a minority, a large majority, if you were to try and guess the percent of Americans that carry some sort of implicit racial bias, what percent would you say?
Gosh, that's a good question. I mean, I don't have the number off the top of my head from the research that I've seen on this, but I would guess that it's something like 3/4 of Americans at least have some kind of implicit bias, if not more. Typically, what researchers have shown is that it's a higher percentage among white Americans than among people of color. I have found this to be the case for myself personally, even during times when I've been doing research and writing about implicit bias. So during the time that I wrote this Black Lives Matter report for the Sentencing Project, I remember I was looking out my window and my neighbor has a car rental service that's set up in his parking spot in the alley, and so people routinely come and go into his driveway to use that car share system, and so I would never think twice about seeing people walking down my alley, walking into my neighbor's driveway to get one of these cars. But I remember once seeing a young group of young men and young women who were African American, and I stopped what I was doing and just looked to see, well, why are they in my neighbor's yard? What exactly, what are they up to? And I realized that's exactly, even though I'm spending all my day thinking about this issue, writing about it, trying to figure out how to solve it, but that's exactly the kind of suspicion that happens when, that people don't necessarily catch that affects their work. And what researchers have found is that the more you make race very salient for people, the more likely you are to help them catch those moments so that they can stop it and do something about it. And so that comes with not just implicit bias training that people would need to undergo, but also with a system of accountability in their work. So if you're a prosecutor or if you're a police officer, with having data on how often are you arresting people, how often are you searching people, what kind of charges are you bringing, and how does that differ by race, People working in the criminal justice system need that kind of feedback and accountability for their work to be able to eradicate the bias that they would otherwise inevitably produce. That's very difficult for anyone living in our society to not create in their work.
Speaking of mechanisms to prevent that kind of bias, as you've talked about, have you come across examples of police departments improving their criminal justice? Anything that we can point to as far as saying this is a route that we should try and emulate?
Sure. So the first thing I would say is, when it comes to policing and when it comes to criminal justice more broadly, I think it's important to have two goals in mind. And one of them is to get rid of bias and disparities. But the other goal is to just scale the whole thing back. So within the criminal justice system and sentencing, that means getting rid of prison sentencing disparities, but also making it so that far fewer people overall, Black, white, Latino, everything, are going to prison and are staying there for a shorter period of time. Those two things need to be done at the same time, because sometimes I think what happens is when we look at very high-profile cases where someone seems to have gotten away with something, especially if they're white and privileged, I think it's a natural instinct to say, that's not fair that they got that deal. What we want to do is make it so that everyone gets the fair and just outcome, not everyone going to the opposite extreme and making sure that the privileged white people that are getting processed are treated like everybody else, but let's treat everybody else with what is often a fair outcome that the privileged white people are getting in the system. Murray Gottschalk, who's a University of Pennsylvania political science professor, has made the argument that even the way we treat white people in this country is too harsh. If we only had white people in prison in the United States, we would still have a mass incarceration problem. So we need to tackle the disparities and bring down police contact and incarceration overall for everyone. I put out this Black Lives Matter report with the Sentencing Project in 2015, and that was after Michael Brown was killed by the officer in Ferguson. And the goal there was to encourage them to think more broadly about how this happens in the criminal justice system as well. A lot of people are harmed with their policing encounters, even if they're not physically hurt, right? Even if it's just the knowing that a person with a weapon pulled you over that didn't need to pull you over, just that possible threat of force that might be used against you is something that is haunting. And that's not trivial, that's significant. And similarly, when you go through different stages of the criminal justice process, levels of freedom are taken away from you, and sometimes that can be fatal. Like, for example, right now during the pandemic, many of us who can are working from home. There's been hardly any meaningful steps to depopulate prisons during the pandemic, even though most prisons way over capacity. These are places where the virus in some places has been spreading rapidly, and it's unnecessarily putting people's lives at risk to keep them in these institutions. Sandra Bland's suicide, Khalif Browder's suicide after he was released from being held for 3 years on Rikers Island, and a substantial portion of that time in solitary confinement. Those are the most extreme ways that we can think about the way the violence that's done to people as a result of their contact with the system, people who shouldn't have had contact with the system at all. But there is, I think, also a broader issue, a broader prevalence of harm that's done to people, even some people who have certainly committed crimes, some people who need to be held accountable for their crime in some kind of way. But especially during this period of the pandemic, it's really underscored for me how little willingness there is to act on the understanding that we have way too many people in the criminal justice system that we don't need to have there.
I think that's all the time we have for today. Nazgol, I really appreciate your expertise, you coming on here and teaching us so much about the nuances of the criminal justice system. I always ask my guests before they leave, this podcast is about trying to have conversations and learning from one another. If you were to leave our audience with one thing to think about, one thing to talk about, what would you have them discuss?
I think that the thing that I would encourage people to think about is when it comes to incarceration in particular and addressing the problem of mass incarceration, for people to realize that whenever they hear someone talk about reducing incarceration for nonviolent drug offenses, that's not going to be enough to ending mass incarceration, because right now, half of the people that are in prison, that are serving sentences of a year or longer in prison, are there for a violent offense. So that includes crimes like assault, robbery, and more serious crimes like rape and murder. So if we want to end mass incarceration in the United States, and I think of that as a goal that's related to the policing reform and defunding discussions that we're having, if we want to end mass incarceration, what we really need to do is move beyond thinking about ending the drug war to also think about why is it that we have these excessive prison sentences for violent crimes when we have so many people serving such very long prison sentences. Shorter sentences for nonviolent offenses seem not so bad. Arrests and dismissals for very minor things seem not so bad. But all of these forms of contact and time within carceral settings are damaging for people and need to be addressed.